I work with ICF International, and we are working with DCED, specifically Christina Powell of DCED, to bring to you this brief overview and question and answer period on grants-based accounting and how it will affect you with your administration of your, specifically in this case, CDBG grants. Tina, would you like to say hello?
Hello.
So Tina will, I'll be doing the most of the presentation, and Tina's going to chip in where she can in terms of answering some of the very specific questions that you might have regarding grants-based accounting and some of the changes that are forthcoming. We also have Chantel Key with ICF. She's going to provide technical support. So if you do have questions in terms of maybe the audio is not working or the video is not working, please go ahead and use the GoToWebinar chat box to contact Chantel, and we'll get into it real quick. So all lines should be muted, and I don't hear anybody, so that's a good thing. If you have a problem hearing me, or if I drop off, again, please use that the question box over in the GoToWebinar box to ask those questions, whether it's a technical or you're having problems hearing, or if you have a content-based questions regarding IDIS or the grants-based accounting. So again, but one of the purposes and one of the reasons DCED wanted to do this was to give you guys an opportunity to ask your questions. So please do make sure you take that opportunity to do so. In terms of the slides and the materials, they are going to be available. If you don't already have a copy, they're going to be available on the DCED's federal website in the resource library section. So if you want to take a moment to go ahead and download those real quick so you can take notes, by all means. Again, I'm going to go fairly slow over the next, oh, I'm sorry. Those are not yet up on the website. So you don't jump off there and get them right now. Those will be up there shortly. But let's continue here. So the agenda is we're going to talk just very quickly about what grants-based accounting is and how it's being rolled out. And then we want to get into some of the nitty-gritty detail in terms of what you're going to see when you are working within the IDIS system. And we want to basically tie a lot of that information back to the information you're getting from DCED throughout the year. Especially one key source of information will be the IDIS setup letter. So hopefully some of you are familiar with this letter that you receive with from DCED. We're going to use that as kind of the keystone in terms of determining how to set up the information in IDIS. We'll also talk about the reports that you can use. We want to provide you an opportunity to see how the information spits out in these reports, so you can do a little self-monitoring and internal control to make sure that you're reporting the data correctly. And at the end of the call, we'll go ahead and take any questions that have come up throughout and try to answer them. I know a lot of these questions can be complex, and you might have a whole scenario, a whole background that you want to get into. If you can, try to get those into the question box. If not, if you want to, and I think Tina sent out an email, or it came from DCED, asking for questions. So if you think it's going to be easier to submit them outside of the webinar format, that's fine. Again, we just want to give you the chance to get your questions asked and give us a chance to answer them. So with that said, let's keep going. And what we're going to do is just a quick little poll. Some of you might have been at the conference we did in Harrisburg, I'm sorry, in State College. That's where the conference was. And so some of you might already have a background on this, but what we're going to do is we're going to open up a poll, and we would like you to participate. So the poll question number 1 is, why do I need to know this? And the choices, you have 4 choices. A, to keep Pennsylvania, in compliance with the action plan and CAPER. B, to prevent repayment by using the correct repayment for not, it should say, for not using the correct funding year. C, to make Tina's life easier by doing things correctly the first time, or D, all of the above. So Chantel, if you could go ahead and open up that poll so we can see what people think.
Okay, the polls are now open. And I noticed here that we have a few responses in the question text box. If you can record your responses in the GoToWebinar toolbar in the polls section, so we can have your response there. We're about 70% of our participants have voted so far, so we'll keep it open for just a few more moments. Okay, I'm going to close and share the results. And we have 5% voted to keep PA in compliance with the action plan, CAPER. 2% voted to prevent repayment by not using the correct funding year. 1% voted to make Tina's life easier, doing things correctly the first time. And 92% said all of the above. Okay.
Yeah, so I mean, there's a lot of good answers here. I guess we were going for all of the above. But the reason for grants-based accounting is, and let's just jump right into that, is it basically it's going to make a stronger connection between the activities that are funded in IDIS and a specific allocation, and that's what it comes down to. Let's take a step back first and find out how the system worked in the past before we get into grants-based accounting, and it was on a first-in, first-out basis. And what essentially that means is if the state had monies from an older year, let's say 2010, 2011, and they indicated that the expense they're processing was for a 2014 or 2015 activity, it really didn't matter what the local grantees or the state entered into IDIS. If that older dollars were there, the system would go ahead and credit that expenditure back to that older grant. So you had activities from 14 and 15 and 16 that were spending these older dollars, which can, of course, lead to a lot of confusion. And what it prevented HUD from doing from a CDBG perspective was to allow them to easily close out the grants. So the impetus for making the switch to grants-based accounting actually came from the home program, but CDBG was dragged kicking and screaming to an extent with the change. So they made it across the board for all 4 of HUD's formula CPD programs, including ESG and HOPWA as well. We're going to focus on CDBG today. So what they changed is that one little thing where if you specify that this activity is supposed to be funded from 2015, when the drawdown occurs, that money will actually come from the 2015 grant allocation. So this is a good thing. It gives you a lot more control about how the data is reported. What we want to talk about, though, is there could be some downsides in terms of timely expenditure of the funds. So by having grantees and IDIS users allocate those funds to those each year, there's the real potential that some funds may get stranded in an older year. So it's not going to make our lives more difficult necessarily, but we want to make sure we understand how the system works and that any potential pitfalls that may come about. And timeliness is probably going to be the largest pitfall. So now that we're in grants-based accounting, we're not actually fully there yet. So the system is going to have a transition period where all grants given before 2015 are going to continue to work on what's called FIFO basis, first in, first out, basically the older method of allocating the funds. Only with the 2015 allocation and subsequent allocations will you see grants-based accounting taken into effect. So what we're going to do is we're going to go through a couple of those IDIS screenshots and show you where some of the changes have taken place. And we'll also discuss some of the changes within the state's program to show you where to keep an eye out in terms of the paperwork with the setup letter. Okay, so some of the key pieces of information that you're going to get from DCED, number one is the program contract. Not a lot will have changed with the program contract because of grants-based accounting. However, in the Appendix A, that's where it's going to talk about, how much time you have to meet a national objective for CDBG. If you are receiving funds from an older allocation, that time frame might have been reduced. You might not get the full 3 years. Typically, that's going to be for competitive grants. So if you're an entitlement grantee, the state, as much as possible, is going to try to make that 3-year contract or that 3-year period valid with that as soon as you get that program contract. So you'll have the full 3 years. However, for some of the competitive, you might not have that full 3-year period to meet a national objective. We'll talk about that in a little bit more detail coming up. The IDIS setup letter, that is the one key piece of information that that's going to help you set up your data correctly in IDIS. One of the things it will specify is, of course, the year it should be associated with, and it will also tell if you could potentially have an award that's funded from more than one allocation. So we will cover how to set that up as well. And finally, you have your invoices that you're submitting in. We could also include closeout reports. Now, how does that information flow into IDIS? Well, we're going to take a look at activity setup and funding, the process of requesting draw vouchers, and the process of reporting accomplishments. Each one of those sections in IDIS, you could be looking at a different year. So it can be confusing because you could have a project that's set up with 2013 that's funded from an allocation from 2014 or from multiple funding years, I should say, and then the draw information and the accomplishment information will be based on other factors. So again, that's why we're having this webinar. We want to make sure that you understand the different years that you'll see in IDIS. So this little graphic kind of tries to correlate the paperwork that you'll see crossing your desk with the information that you see in IDIS. So all the paperwork is on the left side in green. All of the IDIS information is on the right side in blue. So again, we start with that CDBG contract, otherwise known as the blueback, and that pretty much correlates to something that the state does in IDIS, where they will set up a IDIS project, in this case, City of Sunbury entitlement for 2015, and it's assigned a project number. Those are just sequential in the order in which the state sets them up. They would also set up what's called a sub-grant, but again, you don't really need to know that. That's what the state's doing, DCED is doing behind the scenes. You'll also, once that CDBG contract is executed and both parties have signed it, you'll receive what's called an IDIS setup letter. And that IDIS setup letter, again, that's going to be your key document for getting all of this information correctly. In the setup letter, it's going to specify an allocation amount and that project ID. So it will be up to the grantee to, when they come in to set up their IDIS activities, they make sure that they refer back to the project that was cited, that was cited in the setup letter. When you get to activity funding, there'll be another year here, and again, in most cases, that should be the same year. It will have to be the same year for the setup letter. In this case, $750,000 is coming out to 2015, so on activity funding, you want to make sure that you choose the 2015 year and commit the $750,000. Some cases, you might have more than 1 year here, but if so, that information should come from the setup letter. As you go in and submit invoices and you incur costs for this program, that's when you'll come in and request drawdown vouchers, and that will be done by both the grantee and DCED staff. The grantee will create the drawdowns, and DCED staff will approve the drawdowns. And then we get into, finally, some accomplishments. And again, we want to point out the difference here that the accomplishment year here, this is based on the period of performance or when the benefits were realized. So in IDIS, and this is for CDBG, not for home, it could be that you didn't really get a lot done in that first year. So this was a 2015 allocation. The money is coming from 2015 here, but in 2015, you're not going to report any accomplishments until you actually help the people. So in 2015, you might come in and put in a narrative, say, well, we did our bid documents and we selected a contractor, but construction won't begin until 2016. You would actually put that in your 2015 accomplishment narrative. And then when you actually get the service in place, when you actually put these sewer improvements online and people receive a benefit, you would come and report those. If it occurred in the 2016 program year, you would record those as 2016 accomplishments. So again, what we're here to talk about is, what does this year up here mean? What does this year here mean? And what do these years down here mean? Each one could potentially be different. All right? I don't know if we want to pause for questions throughout the training. Let me...
Hey, Bill, it's really up to you. This is Shauna, and we have no questions in the queue.
Okay, very good. That's what I was looking for. So, folks, if you do have any questions, again, it could take some time to write them in there. Just make sure you get your questions asked. Even if we can't answer them on this webinar, we'll know they're on your mind, and we'll want to be able to respond to you via the. We're also going to develop a FAQ, a frequently asked questions document. So we might be able to get the answer into that document as well. So back to the slideshow. Again, this is kind of the general framework, and we'll go into see a couple different scenarios to see how this changes. So let's take a look at some of the examples, though, of what it looks like in IDIS. So this is the screenshot that you see when you actually add an activity. So this would be the point where the DCED has sent you the setup letter. So you come into Plans, Projects, Activities, and you select Add Activity. And the very first thing you have to do when you set up an activity is you have to choose which project that the activity is going to be associated with. So again, this information in this case, it's a City of Sunbury 2014 entitlement. You would click on that button right there. It's when you first start, it says Select Project. So you click on that, and you have to search for that information. And again, that information will be part of the IDIS setup letter. Pretty straightforward there. The fund year, this is where it gets a little bit more confusing. Typically, it's going to be the same as the project year, and this is basically after you set up the activity, and when you go to the funding and drawdown, you would select the activity. In this case, I selected activity 47322. You can also search by project and program year. But in this case, you can see that, here it's a 2013 activity. Whoops. And the grant year is also 2013. This is an example of what it looked like before grants-based accounting came along. We're going to see a more detailed screen. I just couldn't fit it all on this slide. But there could be a case where it's coming from 2015 funds or later, and the screens are going to look slightly different. But again, this information, the funding year, it should be coming from the IDIS setup letter. And there might be cases where you're going to split this across multiple years, though. So we will give you that example in just a second. Okay, and this is the accomplishment year. So this is once you set up the activity, you funded it, you've started to do drawdowns, and now it's the end of the year, and it's come time to report on accomplishments. So the key thing to know for accomplishments is that these are tied not to what year the activity was funded out of, but basically the period of performance. So in this case, I can see I'm still working on that 2013 activity. You can see it's 2013 over here. But if I'm reporting for the 2015 program year, which is, I believe is, Tina, correct me if I'm wrong, would be January of 2015 to December of 2015. If that's what I'm reporting on, then I want to make sure that this field, accomplishments for program year, reads 2015. If it still says 2013 here, and I'm trying to report on 15, that's when I need to use this Add New Accomplishment button. And what that does is it will create multiple copies of this particular screen, and you can separate out your 2013 active accomplishments from your 2014 accomplishments from 2015, so on and so forth. Bottom line is if you have an activity that's open for 36 months, and that's essentially the time frame that the state gives you to meet the national objective, you would have 3 copies of the screen, 1 for each year that it was open. We'll also talk to, let me punt on this last bullet here. There's some cases, again, where you might have more than one activity reporting on the same scope of work, and we'll cover how to report the accomplishments for both activities. All right, so that was just a kind of quick run through. Now we're actually going to go through a couple of the specific screens you would see in an example. So again, here we have City of Sunbury. I'm going to keep using them just because I have access to the training region under Sunbury. They received a setup letter that says, you're going to get $105,000, $105,817 of 2015 money, and it should be associated with this project. So once they receive that setup letter, they're going to come in and set up that street construction activity under this project, 2015-161. Again, all of the information is coming from the IDI setup letter. Once the activity is fully set up, the system would then allow staff to fund it. So in that case, they go to the activity funding screen and they specify $105,000 from 2015. So that's what we want to kind of walk through right now. I'm sorry, I'm going to give you an example too, a second example before we actually get into the screens. So the example number 2 is, this is the one that's mostly going to be for competitive grantees. DCED staff is going to try to not have this happen for the entitlement grantees as much as possible. I don't know if we can make any types of promises regarding that, but this is what it would look like if you have an award that comes from multiple allocations. So in our IDI setup letter here, we can see that some money is coming from 2014, in this case $250,000, and some money is coming from 2015, in this case $500,000. So in that case, DCED staff will actually set up 2 projects, one to reflect the 2014 money and one to reflect the 2015 money. The city staff will actually come in and set up 2 IDIS activities, one for each project, and they're going to have different activity numbers, as you can see. When it comes to funding, the 2014 activity will be funded from 2014. Well, technically it's going to come from the pre-15 money. It will say pre-2015, but you can specify 2014 as the year. And then the 15 money, of course, will come from 15, and this is what where grants-based accounting will come into play. The final note is on accomplishments, in that if you fall into one of these scenarios where you get one award coming from multiple allocations, all of the accomplishments are going to be reported under the activity associated with the oldest year. So you won't report any accomplishments under any subsequent activities. It could be a case where this is funded out of 3 years, and you would actually have something in 2016 as well. But you're not going to report any activities outside of this one. The one and only activity that will get accomplishment data will be the one associated with the oldest program year. And the reason they do that is they don't want to duplicate accomplishments, right? So if this area actually served 9,745 people and you reported that number under both activities, well, in that case, HUD is going to think that you actually helped around 19,000. They're going to double that amount. And so that's the situation we're trying to avoid. So keep that in mind when you're talking about multi-allocation awards funded out of multiple allocations. Again, the state is going to try to minimize this as much as possible, but it could be a situation that you have to deal with. Okay, so now I'm actually going to get into the system and actually show you what this would look like in the screens. So I'm going to switch over to IDIS. It looks like I have to log back in.
And Bill, this is Shauna again. We do have a couple of questions on the queue whenever you.
Okay, yeah, why don't we go ahead and take those now.
The first one is, please clearly distinguish between plan year, program year, fund year, grant year, and any other variation on year.
Okay. So let me get back to the slideshow here.
So plan year, program year, fund year, grant year.
So in terms of the terminology used in the system, and I know it gets a little confusing, whenever you say project year or program year, we're really referring to the information at the activity level and the project level. That is to be compared to, maybe we can actually do this as an FAQ as well, because there is a lot of terminology thrown out there. So the program year and project year, those are going to refer to the information at the project level and the activity level. When you get down to the funding, they're going to use the term grant year. We are also at the state level, this is what we're referring to as the allocation year, okay? So I don't know if I don't have any document in front of me that makes that super clear, but program year and project are going to refer to the year associated with the project or the activity. Grant year or allocation is the year associated with the funding, and then accomplishment year is the year in which you report on your data, basically the period of performance. So again, you could have a 2013 project, but if it's open for 2013, 14, and 15, you're going to have an accomplishment year for 13, an accomplishment year for 14, an accomplishment year for 15. So it's all, everything's talking about the accomplishment. So I don't know if I fully answered that, but perhaps this is a good question for the FAQ.
I think that sounds good.
Okay.
Next question, should we go into IDIS and update every activity at the end of the calendar year, regardless of whether or not we've had any draws?
So that's a great question. I would recommend that at least you go in and put in a narrative. And Tina can jump in here as well. I don't know if she's really using that narrative, but the HUD guidance is that any activity that was open during the year, regardless, even if it didn't have any draws, I would say actually, especially if it didn't have any draws, you can use the accomplishment narrative, and let me just pull that up real quick. You can use the accomplishment narrative to explain what's going on. So I'm just going to pull up any CDBG activity here. So maybe this is a good example. This is Chestnut Street Utilities, and let's say it's from 2011. Well, in that case, I would actually first specify 2011 here. Let me get back there real quick. So if this is my accomplishment year for 2011, and I can't put in any information in terms of who was assisted, I can still use this accomplishment narrative to explain where I am in the process. So maybe I could talk about the environmental is complete, we've gone out and done the bids, we've selected a contractor, and we expect construction to begin on such and such date. So I know it's a little different for the state in that they might have you reporting elsewhere, and again, this is where I'll let Tina break in. But HUD, if HUD is looking at this data and they see expenditures or they don't see any expenditures and nothing has happened, typically you can kind of forestall a lot of their questions by actually putting in a narrative to describe what has happened to date. And again, that narrative does show up for any activity that was open during that program year. So here I have a 2011 activity, and let's say I'm in my 2015 year. If this activity is still open, it will still appear on my 2015 report. So I don't want to put in my narrative here for 2011. What I would do is hit Add New Accomplishment Year and type in 2015. Tina, did you want to add anything in terms of what you're looking for in terms of the accomplishment narrative and whether you want that in there for every single activity, even if it hasn't dispersed funds in the program year?
Yes. Well, there are two things that we need to look at on this screen. The first is a regular CDBG activity. You are correct that we would like an accomplishment narrative entered. And that narrative is available not just to DCED, but available to HUD headquarters and right-to-know requests. It does not, you can see it says maximum 4,000 characters. So be brief. We don't need a whole scenario of what exactly happened, but just a brief narrative along the lines of maybe project went to bid, environmental review complete. And if people did not benefit, this is where you would stop. Enter the narrative and save. Do not hit save and continue to go on where you enter the beneficiaries. If it's a direct benefit data or direct benefit activity, that would be, you would want to continue and say you've helped 5 homeowners. That would be different. But for your low mod area benefit in the first year that did not have any, did not meet the national objective, enter your accomplishment narrative and just save. You will continue to get the CDBG flagging until the beneficiaries are entered. Do not enter them prematurely because that will mess up our annual reports. Also, the trick to this screen is that it needs to be done before December 31st because Pennsylvania's report year is from January to December. We need the beneficiaries entered prior to the end of the calendar year so that they are reported accurately on our CAPER. And we will download the data on January, as close to January 1st as we can. It's probably January 2nd or depending on the next business day after the 1st is when we will download the information for our CAPER. The other thing to note on this screen is if it's a multi-year activity, and Bill was going to come back to that, meaning that it is the same project, same scope of work as the prior year's activity, maybe it's funded out of multiple bluebacks. In that case, you would not enter anything on this screen. You would not even enter a narrative because all of that information will be entered in the earliest year's activity. And if you have additional questions, please put them in the question box, and we will be including that information in the FAQ document. It's a good question.
Thanks, Tina.
And I think both you, Bill, and Tina touched on the other questions that people had in the queue related to when to report. So I think for now, keep going.
Okay, great. So I'm going to walk through kind of the whole situation in terms of going through and setting up an activity. I can't remember where we were exactly on the slides. Let me get to it really quickly. So I'm going to set up an activity. I'm going to show you the funding screens, and then we'll go ahead and create a draw, and then again we'll come and revisit these accomplishment screens real quick. So I'm going to stick with that Sunbury example. I'm going to see so when you first set up your activities, you'll come to Activity Add over here. It's under Plans, Projects, Activities. And again, the first thing you'll want to do is look at that IDIS setup letter and hit Select Projects. And if you just hit Search, it will give you a list of all of the kind of the history of your projects. I'm going to go ahead and choose 2014 entitlement. So basically, that's the very first step that you're going to do when you get that IDI setup letter is add the activities and associate it to the correct project. Okay. So what Tina was saying is, okay, well, if this is actually coming from multiple applications, maybe some's coming from 13, some comes from 14, you're actually going to set up 2 projects. One would be under this project and one be under this project. You're going to see some extras here because we've used these a couple times for demonstrations. Typically, you're only going to have 1 project per year for each funding source. So let me go ahead and I'm just going to do admin as an example. That way I don't have to do all of the setup screens. So I'm just going to call it test 2014 admin, and I'll choose the matrix code. Environmental review we'll say is exempt, and I hit save. Okay, so for most activities you would actually have to go down the setup detail page. Since this is an admin activity, you don't have to, but you can see it is actually ready to fund. Okay, so at this point it's assigned me an activity number. I could go ahead and go up to funding and drawdown and enter that number. I can also use this shortcut right here that says activity funding. I'm going to go ahead and do that. Okay, so when I get to this screen, it basically gives me some summary information at the top. It shows me my different funding available here, and you can see at this point it doesn't break it out in any year. It's basically just all lumped together by recipient, program, and fund type. And it does show me $503,000 available for funding. So if I hit Add Edit here, this is where it really changes, folks, in that I have kind of 2 sets of information. I have this part right up here that's labeled Funding Source Pre-2015, and down here, just Funding Source, but I can see it's actually specifying a grant year. Here it's not specifying a grant year. So this is where all of the pre-15 money that's still going to operate on first in, first out, that's where this lives up here. And you can see in the case of Sunbury, they only have $13,000 available. But for 2015, they have $490,000. What I would do, again, is I would reference my IDIS setup letter. And if it says it's coming from 2014, I would come here to grant year, plug in 2014, and plug in the amount that I want to fund this for. Once I hit save, you can see that my available for funding went down, and that money is now committed to this activity. But I didn't fund it out of 2015. So when I get to the drawdown, let me show you how that works. I'm going to come to Create Drawdown. Just make sure I remember this number. And I'm going to hit Continue. So basically, this is just where you specify which activities you want to include on your drawdown. So I'm going to hit Continue. You can see here's my activity. It's funded for $10,000. The grant year at this point says pre-2015. So again, it hasn't specified a year. I'm just going to go ahead and put in maybe 99 bucks and hit Confirm Voucher. Now when I get to the confirmation here, for anything funded before 15, it's going to basically, again, it's going to work on that first in, first out basis. And you'll see that under this grant year, it's coming from an older year, even though when I set up the activity and when I funded the activity, I specified 2014. So the lesson here is whenever you're dealing with pre-15 monies, 2014, 2013, 2012, don't worry about what it says on this drawdown right here, because again, the system's going to keep using first in, first out. However, that's only on the drawdown. You still have to make sure that you're using the correct year when it comes to funding the activity. So it's really important that you specify the right year when you're under activity funding on this screen where you're actually specifying the money amount to fund. you have to make sure that this year is correct. And chances are you've been doing that already for the last 3-4 years, maybe 5 or 6. It's really important to get this year correct. Okay, if it shows up as a different year under when you do the drawdown, that's fine. That's totally beyond our control, and that's what's actually going to change. So let me show you how it would be different if this is actually funded out of 2015. So I'm going to zero that out. And I could go back and put this under a 2015 project. I'm just going to go ahead and update the funds. Again, you would want to reference your IDIS setup letter to decide whether this should be funded out of 14 or 15. This is what the screen looks like now. Once the DCED receives its 16 and 17 and 18 grants from HUD, this list is just going to keep growing and growing and growing, and you'll be able to see how much money associated with each year is still available to you. So I'm going to fund this out of 2015. I hit save. You can see it's funded. My available for funding went down. If I go back and do the voucher again for the same activity, you'll see that it automatically specifies 2015, and that's because 15 and later grants are going to be working on grants-based accounting. So I want to make sure that if this is coming out of 15 or later, it actually specifies the correct year here. And when I go to do the drawdown again, when you get to this drawdown confirmation, you want to make sure that this is coming from the correct year. So for 15, 16, 17, everything after 15, make sure that it shows the correct year. For 14 and before, it really doesn't matter. The system's just going to assign it based on the oldest year available. Okay, so that's what it looks like for a single activity. Why don't we get into what it's going to look? Oh, I'm sorry, I haven't done accomplishments. And you wouldn't do accomplishments for a single admin activity anyway, so maybe we'll do a multi-year activity instead. And I think we have a lot of time. Maybe this is a good time to break for questions, though. Shauna, do we have any questions that have popped up?
Not since the last time. We'll see if we have time at the end, Bill, where people have more specific questions about various activities and accomplishment reporting. But,
okay.
But nothing else.
Okay, thanks. So what I'm going to do now here is I'm going to demonstrate the what it looks like to have multiple activities for a single award. So here, let's see, just going to reuse some older activities. Maybe we can use that Chestnut Street reconstruction. So you can see here under 2013, there's a Chestnut Street reconstruction. I believe there's an older one as well. Yeah, so here's 2011 and 2012. So you can see that, and I don't know if this was phased in or not, but let's assume that this was, well, that one's completed. Why don't I do this? I'm just going to start from scratch with a new example. So let's assume that Sunbury gets money for a large commercial, well, let's do a large housing development. Let's do SOARs. I keep switching around. I'm going to do SOARs. All right, so let's assume that Sunbury gets an award, and it's funded both out of 2014 and 2015 monies. And how would we set that up in IDIS? So, well, yeah, let's do 14 and 15. I might have to actually add a project really quick here. I thought I had one. Give me 1 second. This is what the state staff sees, is they need to come in here and add a project for 2015. We'll call it City of Sunbury 2015 entitlement. course, they would come in here and put in the description in terms of how the funds were used, and let's say they're going to get $500,000, 2015. So again, you can kind of ignore this part. This is what the state would do. But that project wasn't added yet, so I had to add it. All right, so now we're back to Sunbury. Okay, so the situation is they're doing a sewer improvements project. They get a single award, but that award is funded out of multiple allocations. It's funded out of both 14 and 15 monies. So if we were to go back to the slideshow, it would look like something like this, where you have some money coming out of 14 and some money coming out of 15. In that case, the city or the state is going to set up 2 projects. It will be up to the city to set up 2 activities and make sure they're funded from the correct years. So I'm going to go ahead and set up the 14 activity first and then the 15 activity. So I go to add, and I'm going to add under 2014. So there's the City of Sunbury. And I'm just going to call it test or training here. So that would be 03J as our matrix code. And I'm going to do this fairly quickly. So our national objective, let's go ahead. Just to make this a little easier on me, I'm going to do low-mod housing. So maybe that sewer improvements is connected to a housing development. And we are going to report on, so 2014, we'll go ahead and say 10 housing units. All of this information is pretty straightforward. Okay, so when you set up the second activity, this is going to be a very important field associated to another activity. This is where you will say yes, and you actually specify this activity number. Since this activity is the 2014 one, it's the one associated with the oldest program year, this activity will actually do the accomplishments. So we're going to leave that at no. I'm going to go ahead and select Sunbury here. Not
yes,
sure
no,
why
that's actually accurate because that is a glitch at IDIS where the grantees can't select themselves, so they need to contact DCED to select the UGLUG for them.
Oh, really? Interesting. Okay, so will we be able to get past the screen without that?
No.
Interesting. Alrighty.
What you can do is select another UGLUG. Grantees do not do this, but for Bill, no, or you can select it and do it correctly. If you do select profile, go to Pennsylvania, and then you can select Sunbury.
I'll just do that really quick. Has HUD given you a time frame on correcting that?
Because
chances are
workaround, it has not been a high priority item, but it is annoying as to the grantees as well as us.
No kidding. I'm just going to stay logged in as the state for a second.
And for the grantees, when we do the UGLUG step, the information that is on this CDBG setup detail page 1, this is what we want you to correct because we are not looking at the information in your application. So when we say the UGLUG selected, correct that. Make sure that your national objective is correct, your proposed accomplishments are correct, your performance objective and outcome, and that type of information. And then after you finish your setup detail page 1, you would go on to page 2 and 3 as necessary until you get ready to fund equals yes on that main activity description page.
That's right. Whoops. All right, so I think I can get past the screen. So I'm going to just go ahead and do survey. All of this information, pretty straightforward. In this case for sewer improvements, probably not a lot going on there. And I'm just going to make something up. Let's see if it takes it. I need 4 digits. Let's see if it saves. Okay, so I provided some survey data, and now, as Tina mentioned, it says ready to fund equals yes. So that means I can fund this activity. This is a 2014. It's basically one of 2 activities. And I can come to funding. And when I come to add edit funding, I want to specify again, even though I have 15 money here, I need to fund the 14 portion out of here. So let's assume it's just $10,000. Maybe you guys did a budget modification and you're going to use those older dollars for this larger project. Okay, so this is a 14 activity. You can see it's funded from 14. And when I go to do the drawdown, again, don't bother with the year. It doesn't matter what the year is, as long as it's not 15 or one of the specific years. So for the second activity, maybe I can just go back and reuse this so you guys don't have to watch all that again. But for the second activity, I would come in here and I would make sure I choose 2015. So I chose a 2015 activity. And when I set up this activity, I want to make sure I answer yes to this question. Not only do I answer yes, I go also specify which activity ID is the activity that will accept all of the accomplishments. So on this one right here, it's really key, or for this activity right here for 2015, it's key that when I'm setting it up, I answer yes to this question. When it comes time to report accomplishments, when I'm right here at the end of the program year, so let's say this was a 2015, I got the award in 2015, so my first year, even though it had some 2014 dollars in, I don't want to put in a 2014 here. I want to report on the period of performance. So I want to report on everything that happened from January of 15 to December of 15. So I would plug in 2015. I would put in my narrative, so maybe environmental complete, bidding complete, construction due to begin, and maybe let's say spring of 16. So I put in my narrative, HUD's happy, Tina's happy, everybody's happy, they can see what's going on. I go ahead and save it. And so all of these accomplishments are going under the oldest activity. So of these 2 activities, I would put all my accomplishments under the 2014 activity and nothing under the 2015 activity. When it comes around to the second year, I would come back to that same screen under accomplishments for my 2014 activity. And you can see this information is for 2015. I don't want to just add on information here. I don't want to just come here and add on a bunch of information, because that period of performance is over. I need to report on my 2016 period of performance, so I would hit new accomplishment year. type in 2016, and put in all my accomplishments right here.
And hey, Bill, I think you slowed up a little bit, but just folks just want to make sure you do this a little slower if possible, just because it's a lot with the screen. So.
Okay. So what I wanted to do is, this is basically the heart of the issue. Is it's on accomplishment detail, page 1. To get here, it's just you find your activity under plans, projects, and activities, and you want to use this button, edit CDBG accomplishments, to get to the accomplishment page. And it's all the information is basically right here. The add new accomplishment year, the accomplishment right here, and select another year right here. And again, this is documented in the slide as well. You can see that it's going to default to the most current program year. So in this case, 2016. If I want to go back and visit an older year, I can use this drop down and look at what happened in those older years. So it's really, really important for CDBG, not for home. Home's completely different, but for CDBG that you separate out your accomplishments by the year in which the accomplishments occurred. So everything on this screen, the environmental, big complete, that describes what happened in 2015. When I need to report to the state and the HUD on what happened in 2016, I need to make sure that this year reads 2016, even if it's for a 2015 activity or 2014 activity. This reflects the period of performance. Okay? If I did go through any parts too fast, please let me know, and I can back up and revisit some of those.
Maybe take a couple of examples here, because folks have written in a few examples, Bill. Would this be a good time?
Sure.
Okay, this one is specifically on reporting accomplishment. Say I have a homeowner rehabilitation project, and each year I apply for more money for homeowner rehabilitation, and each year I get a new contract with new homeowner rehabilitation funding. So with my 2013 contract, I did 5 houses. With my 2014 contract, I did 7 houses. With my 2015 contract, I did 3 houses. Do I really report all my houses on my 2013 grant?
And Tina might be able to jump in here with some of these specifics. But if those are separate contracts, and each contract has a separate funding letter, I think it would be different if you modified the 2013 to include additional rehabs. But and again, Tina, feel free to correct me if I'm wrong. I think you would have at least you would have 3 separate projects: one for 13, one for 14, one for 15. You would have 3 separate activities, again, one for 13, one for 14, and one for 15. And those accomplishments, the 5 units, the 7 units, and the 3 units, would each be reported under their own activity. Tina, do you want to chime in here?
Yes, for that particular example, it would go back to how did you apply for the funds to your grant manager. And out of the 2013 contract, did you say that you were going to do approximately 5 houses, or did you say that you would do 15 houses? Because we need to tie back your accomplishments of your 2013 contract to a national objective. Was your national objective met within those 3 years? So in that example, it sounds to me that you would want to break them apart as 3 separate activities. And you would follow your activity description as approved by your grant manager. I understand that with the environment that maybe you couldn't do all 5 houses out of your 2013, maybe you could only do 4 because of the cost involved. And that's okay. But we want to see that you get as close as possible, because Pennsylvania has to update our proposed accomplishments in our action plan and our consolidated plan. And then HUD wants to see the accomplishments tied back to those grant funds. So if you come in and say that you're doing 15 houses and you only report 5, that means that we have to come up with a reason. Why was your estimate so off? What happened? Changes in the environment, budget, modifications, revisions. We need to explain why the big difference. And again, it goes back to trying to meet your national objective per contract, not just drawing down the funds. So we want to see that your national objective is met within those first 3 years of your 2013 contract, first 3 years of the 2014, and first 3 years of the 2015. And when the state does get caught up on their monitoring, we would like to close out those grants officially with HUD as well.
Okay, so I'm gonna, can everybody see my screen still? Can Shauna, does it look okay?
Yeah.
Okay, I'm gonna try to diagram it out. I think that might be the easiest way. Okay, so what we heard was, you know, you got money in 13, you got some money in 14, and you got some money in 15. And again, if these were basically separate allocations that you just continue to get homeowner rehab for, it would look like this, where you have a separate activity. And I don't know if this, the asker or the person who asked the question can specify whether it was under 3 separate agreements, but it would look something like this.
Bill, there were 3 separate contracts is what they're saying.
Okay, great. So if that's the case, you have 3 separate contracts. It would look like this, where you have 3 separate projects, 3 separate activities, and the funding, again, should specify, it should tie back to that project here in the setup letter. So 13 should be funded from 13, 14 should be funded from 14, and 15 should be funded from 15. Now, the difference here, though, is, okay, so you said you helped, let's say you assisted, I think you said 5 housing units in the first year. Now, if that money, that $250,000, it could be that under that activity, let's say you only assisted 4 units in the 13 year, and you still had some money left over. So in 2014,
She did 7.
with this money, you did that 1 extra unit. And then you started using your $14, and you said you did 7 units. Well, again, let me split it here. So I think you said 3 units. So it could look like this, where you know, you said, in this case, HUD, you're reporting to HUD that with these $2013, I helped a total of 5 units. 4 of them received the benefit. Basically, you finished those rehabs in 13, and 1 of them in 14. Now, I reported accomplishments for 14 as well, but these accomplishments are tied to this actual award, right? So hopefully this makes sense. Now, one of the other possibilities is, okay, well, let's say you just reprogrammed, you did a budget mod for 2013, and all of a sudden, let's say maybe you're doing, I'm going to say you're going to do some commercial repair, and that project fell through, or you wanted to move an extra $500,000 or $50,000 over here. If that's the case, you would need to adjust this up, and again, it would be tied with your 13 activity, and then maybe you're going to do even more in this final 3rd year of that 13 contract. So hopefully that makes sense. Go ahead.
So Bill, so they said it was very helpful, the diagram, Bill. I think the one thing that you could clarify is in the accomplishment detail box, because we talked about reporting on accomplishments on the earlier year, the first year. So folks are just need some clarification around where they would put the 4, 1, and 3 in your example.
Okay, so in this particular example, what you would have is on 2013, this is where I would report, and I can't remember what I said in my example. 4 units. So this would be 4 units rehabbed. And again, so everything on this screen reflects on what occurred in 2013. It's going to look a little funny because it's associated with the 2015 project right now.
And Bill, if I may interject, your example is currently using a low-mod area benefit. If you would change the national objective to low-mod housing, you will see the direct benefit data.
Okay, I can do that. I'm going to change this to 14A as well then. Okay. So here's the direct benefit data. So for 13, if I reported a total of 4 units, I would come in here and actually report on those 4 owners. Okay. So that would be 13. I'm sorry, actually, look, I made a mistake, right? 2016. I wouldn't want to put anything in here. If you want to actually delete a year, you can delete a year too by hitting delete up here. But I would want to try to find 2013. So 2013 would be 4 units rehabbed. I'll go ahead and report those 4 units here. In 2014, remember that this activity, it doesn't represent everything you did that year, because if I get back to the diagram, I did a total of 7 units in 14, right? But 6 were associated with this activity, so I would report those 6 units with this activity, and I report this 1 unit under this activity. So again, I did 7 units, but since they were associated with different allocations, I'm going to report those, the 1 under 330002 and then the 6 under 33005. So I would come in here and do 2014. In this case, I would say 1 additional unit rehabbed. So again, back on this setup detail page 5, it's going to automatically go to the most current year. But if I want to go back and look at my history, I can look at 13, and there's my 4 units rehabbed. I look at 14, there's my 1 additional unit rehabbed. So it's really having multiple copies of this accomplishment detail by doing this add new accomplishment year that allows you to kind of break it out in the same format here. Okay. So hopefully that answered your questions. If you do have follow-up questions about that same issue, let me know.
Yeah. What if you fund a unit with 2014 funds and 2015 funds? Which year would you report the unit?
That's a good question. Again, HUD does not want to, they want to try to avoid double counting as much as possible. I don't know, Tina, do you have any good feedback on that?
Yes, it doesn't necessarily matter which year you choose to enter that split unit, which contract you choose to enter that split unit. Like in this example, that 2014 funds, if you had the 1 unit that was funded out of your 2013 grant and 6 units funded out of your 2014, if you had 1 unit that was split, maybe used 10,000 of 13 funds and 40,000 of 14 funds, you would choose which activity would take that accomplishment unit. The best thing to do is look to see what you propose to your grant manager, how close you are to each one. Some people choose the activity based on how much money, the bulk of the money came out of 14, they would choose to put it under the 14 contract. But the easiest thing to do is whenever you do make that decision, it will need to be put in the accomplishment narrative, because when we do come to monitor, we will need to see that the costs are broken out between each contract, because that one house is going to have to follow the conditions of the 2013 contract and the conditions of the 2014 contract. So you got to watch the Appendix A, Appendix C of both contracts to make sure that you are in compliance.
Very good. So in other words, reported under one or the other, not both.
And enter the information in the narrative.
Yeah, and then the funding and the dollars would still be split between the two activities.
Okay,
Yeah,
great.
so there's going to be a couple. There's going to be a couple of those situations, folks. I would really highly encourage you to, when you run across those, talk to your grant managers at DCED and make sure that you're on the same page with them in terms of how to report that.
So we did homeowner rehabilitation. Maybe we could take a sidewalk project. So if there was a sidewalk project using funds from 2012, 2013, 2014, and 2015. And for 2012 and 2013, funds were added through a revision from some leftover funds. Basically, would it work the same way as homeowner rehabilitation example that you just did?
All right, so can you walk through the example one more time for me? You said it was funded out of
2012, 2013, 2014, and 2015.
Okay.
And basically, like 2012 and 2013 were added through a revision.
They were budget mods.
Yeah, budget mods. Yeah.
And so in that example, what is the national objective for that sidewalk project? Because if it is a limited clientele where you have used presumed benefit, maybe you're doing the curb cuts, or are you doing the sidewalks based on a low mod area benefit, because the public facilities project will be driven by that national objective.
Can you, whoever asked that question, if you could go ahead and pop that into the question box, what national objective you're using. And I guess another question for you, Tina, would be if this was originally started as a 14-15 activity and then they started adding $12 and $13 to it, would all the accomplishments go under that first activity, that 14 activity?
Yes, I would agree with that assessment if it is a true multi-year activity where the bulk of the work is being run by the 14, and then you would go back when you're adding the activity on 12 and 13 through a budget modification. Once approved by the grant manager, you would say in 12, yes, accomplishments are reported under the 2014 activity, same with the 2013. When you're doing your budget modification, yes, accomplishments are reported under the 2014. With that one, you really have to watch the timeliness on that. If you are adding a total of 4 years funding, how soon is that sidewalk project going to be completed? How soon is that national objective going to be met? I understand that you're using the end of the 12 contract, but you need to watch your 3-year timeliness. So the last 2 years of your contract are for administration and closeout, they should not be used for project costs.
I got 2 national objectives. I got low mod area and I got limited clientele. So why don't you just do one example using one of them?
Okay, so I'm going to try to sketch it out in PowerPoint first. Okay, we're going to stick with Sunbury. One of these days I'll have to visit. All right, so we had 4 different years. So it started off, however, we'll kind of do this chronologically here. Maybe move these off screen here. So it started with a 2014 project, and you would set up your activity, and you would fund it with $14, and you do your drawdowns and your accomplishment detail here. Get this out of the way. Okay, so it would start off looking like this, where you have your 14 activity, and then you also would have your 15 activity if it was split right from the start. But then on your accomplishment detail, you're going to check that box for 15. You're not going to report any accomplishments. So when you set up this activity, you're going to say all accomplishments are reported under this activity over here under 2014. So hopefully you're with me now for now. And then what would happen is say, okay, well then you come in and you ask for a budget mod for 2012 and 2013. I'm just going to do 2013 maybe. So 2013, you would come in here, and as Tina said, once your budget mod gets approved, then the city or the DCED would allow you to come in here and set up a new activity under 2013. And you would go ahead and fund it again out of 2013, and then, but for your accomplishment details, again, you're going to point back to this activity, to the 2014 activity. You're not going to report accomplishments under 2013, or if you did 2012 as well, under 2012. So the projects and the activities are, again, tying back to specific contracts. And in most cases, that allocation is going to be the same as that contract. But it doesn't have to be, especially for competitive. So if whoever asked that question, if this helps, I don't know if you actually want me to go into IDIS and show the screens, but we could try that. But if you think this is enough, we can move on.
And
Any
so
feedback, Sean?
The
I'd like to
feedback
add-
is this is helpful. Bill, thank you.
Okay, Tina, did you say?
Yes, I'd like to add that in IDIS, I want all 3 of those years to remain open until that national objective is met. And the reason is so that Pennsylvania and your grant manager can watch the compliance. I don't want it changed to completed whenever you draw all your 2015 funds and your 2013 just because you don't have any beneficiaries. They should remain open until your national objective is met. And the nice thing about that is when you do meet your national objective in the center column, maybe in 2015, because of this multi-year project where everybody will benefit all at once, that's when you can go in, do your completion check for your 13, and then just change it to completed. After the national objective is met, do your completion check for 15, change your national objective to completed, because all the accomplishments are reported in 14, so that's as far as you need to go. And then once you're doing the 14, do your completion check after you've entered your accomplishments in that final year, and then you can change it to completed.
That's a really good point. The status in IDIS, you should only mark it as complete once you've reported all of the expenditures associated with that activity and you've met the national objective. That's a really good point to make. Other questions, Shauna?
A pretty simple one came in a while ago, and I apologize that we're just now waiting. On the setup, are you supposed to use the grantee's address?
Oh, okay. So under the address information. So let me get back to that.
Yeah, on the setup screen.
So folks, I'm here under Plans, Projects, Activities. I'm under Edit Activity. To get back there, you use Search. And I'm going to the Setup Detail. On that page, if you scroll down about halfway down, you'll see the address. I was always told by HUD that this information should reflect where the beneficiary, where the benefit is going in the community. So if you would always put in like the City Hall address or the address of the administrator, when HUD actually takes this and maps it out for geographic analysis, all of those little icons would be at City Hall, and they wouldn't be able to properly assess where the benefit went on a geographic basis. So as much as possible, I try to encourage people to put in the address that describes where the benefit is taking place. In a lot of cases, that is not possible. I wouldn't worry about it so much for low-mod area activities, because for low-mod area activities, later on you'll specify a census tract and block group, and they can map it based on that. But for instance, if you were doing like a community center and you had that address, you could put in the address of the community center. State grantees for the DCED, for everybody on the phone, I don't believe you have to actually break out each address for each rehab. Tina, do you know if that's the case? You guys do not have to do that, correct?
That is correct. That is not a federal requirement, but as you can see on that screen for the low-mod housing activity, there's an Add Additional Locations button, and that is for the housing activities. If you are doing your sewer, your address would not be 123 Main Street. It could be Elm Street to Main Street. So it could be a larger area because you cannot pinpoint an exact address for that one. And then when you do, there is a field after you do validate this address. I believe there's a little checkbox that says you can skip it in order to continue to the next screen.
Yeah, so if you put something like this, and again, this describes basically, this is information that shows up on the end-of-year report that is made publicly available. So this address information, again, HUD would like you to map it, but it's also meant to express to the people reading the report, the members of the public, where this beneficiary, where the benefit went in the community. And as Tina said, is if you try to validate the address and it can't find it, that's fine if you know it's a valid address and it's just the system can't find it, or if it's not a one specific address, if it's a multiple addresses, you can use the skip validation for now, and the system will totally accept that. You do not have to go back and change the address later. You can leave it as is long as you feel it properly expresses where the benefit's going.
So a couple of related questions about not having the address, about whether or not that'll trigger any red flags, et cetera.
So if you put something like to be determined at the beginning, that's fine. I would, as a rule, when you go back and try to complete the activity, you might come back to the setup screens and review the information and see if there's anything that needs to be changed. So that way, if you did to be determined at the beginning, but then you found out it's going to be on Main Street and 2nd, you could come back and put in that address later. The system will make you put something in here. So even if you put, a whole bunch of nonsense and hit validate and then check this box, the system will let you get past that. If you don't have a valid address at that first point, again, I would put something to be determined, or talk with your grants manager and see if they have some advice for you. Yeah, so I would come back and make sure it doesn't have to be a valid address, but it should be something, an actual description of where the benefit took place, if that makes sense.
And last question for now, or just point, it sounds like there was a 2009 IDS manual that was provided, and basically they wanted to know, can DCED prepare and assemble an update to this reference guide?
That would be a Tina question.
We will have an update that will be similar. It won't be the exact same guide. We are working on a grants-based accounting manual that will take you through what is required on each screen, similar to what Bill had done today, from the IDIS setup letter onto funding activity completion. And then we will have the frequently asked questions document that will include the questions that were asked today, as well as any additional ones that we receive in the next couple weeks.
Okay, and then back on the address, sorry, this just came in, Bill. Do you list each address for a demolition activity?
You don't have to. It depends on how you're setting it up. In some cases, grantees will set up a separate activity for each demolition, and if that's the case, then yes, you could go ahead and put in the actual address for each demo, because you would see this for each activity. If all of those demolitions are grouped under the same address, or same activity rather, it won't make any sense if you just put in, like, First Street here, Second Street here, Third Street here. The system won't be able to find that. It would be nice to map it. If it's based on a low-mod area, then HUD would have that geographic information based on the census and tract and block group. Otherwise, you might just put scattered site, or maybe just put in the first address and use the narrative to explain that other addresses were also assisted. Essentially, HUD wants this data so they can make those maps that are available up on their website. And if we're not putting in the address information or validating the information, it makes that tool less valuable to them.
Okay, a couple more questions, you guys. So one person clarified something that we're chatting about. So they wanted to know whether or not they will be contacted to find out if a project is complete when it is not an IDIS.
Can you read that one more time?
It says, will you be continually contacting us to find out if the project is complete, since it's not an IDIS?
Oh,
if it's not marked as complete in IDIS.
That is correct. That will be triggered by the CDBG activity flags, if I understand the question correctly. And it will automatically flag the activity. I believe if it's 1 year without draws or so many years without beneficiaries,
That's correct.
It's required. It's been a little bit since I've looked at that. Crystal has done an excellent job trying to keep that up to date. So that is still a requirement, and yes, we will be contacting you. So please, if you do, in the example earlier when Bill had shown our accomplishments reported in another activity, the goal there is to try to get these activities completed, going back to timeliness, get them completed within the 3 years, so that it will be less reporting burden on both you as the grantee and DCED. So hope that answers that question.
Yeah, and you're right about the flags. It's basically 1 year without a draw, or 3 years without being completed, or 80% drawn without accomplishment data. Those are the 3 flags. Go ahead, Sean.
I believe nothing further at this time, but you folks have kept me on my toes.
Okay. Well, why don't we go back to the slides, and I just want to cover a couple more slides in terms of reports, and then we can get back to the system. So these are just some screenshots that are calling out, and again, this will be in the manual. Just these are the screenshots we've already done, but this screenshot, it's a little hard to read. It's just a little squished up, but again, we're trying to call out the difference between the pre-2015 information at the top and the 2015 money and future monies that will be listed at the bottom. Okay, why don't we do one more poll, try to catch you sleeping. For CDBG, where do you find the funding year to enter on the activity funding screen. A, use the calendar year the contract was awarded. B, use the calendar year and when you are actually funding the activity. C, use the calendar year when the national objective is met. Or D, use the program year on the IDIS setup letter. So Chantel, if we can go ahead and open up that poll and give people a chance to vote.
And we have about 45% of our participants voted so far. So they're rolling in. Okay, we are about 75%, so I'm going to go ahead and close it now and share the results. And we have 8% voted use the calendar year that the contract was awarded, 8% as well for use calendar year and when actual funding and when actually funding the activity. We have 1% at use the calendar year when the national objective is met, and 83% voted use the program year on the IDIS setup letter.
All right, so it looks like most of you got it. It was supposed to be D. So again, that IDIS setup letter, that's going to be key when funding your activity. So I'm not going to hold it against you, those of you who might not have gotten it right, but what we're referring to is basically on that funding drawdown, when you fund the activity, and I'm just going to go ahead and choose any activity here. It's really important when we get to this part and we choose our funding source and we have a split between our pre-15 money and then our 15 money going forward, that we specify the right year here. In this year, this grant year here, is based on that IDIS setup letter. So that's really, really important that you guys get that, because so much depends. A lot of the program compliance ratios that HUD looks at is based on the year that we're selecting here. All right? So if you don't take anything else away from that, from today's discussion, make sure that you put in the grant year on this screen based on the IDIS setup letter. Okay, so there are a couple reports out there that will help you kind of track and ensure that this information is correct. Number one is the PRO2. This is probably the most popular IDIS report out there. And it's just a simple list of your project information, or first plan year, then project, and then activity. And then for each activity, it gives you your funded amount, your drawn amount, and the balance. So there you can check to make sure that the activity at least matches up with the setup funding letter. It won't necessarily tell you if the funding information is lined up. To do that, we can look at the PRO5 report, which is the drawdown report by project and activity. So this is an example of the PRO2. Again, you'll see it first lists the plan year over here to the left, then your projects and the project title. In this case, we have City of Sunbury 14 entitlement, City of 14 Sunbury 2014 competitive. Each activity has its activity number, the activity name, status, and the funded amount, the drawn amount, and the balance. So on this one, you can see an example. Here is Chestnut Street Utilities. You can see that it's associated. Well, maybe that's not a good example. I think this is one that I may have messed up with some training information. But you know, this is, again, you can use this report to verify that this information should match your program contract, right? Basically, the breakdown of one project should match your program contract. Now, if it's coming from multiple funding years, what you'll see there is on the PRO5 report. So the PRO5 is a similar organization, but it breaks down all the expenditures by voucher. So we have our program year 2014, our project number and title 151 Sunbury, the activity, and then for each activity, we have these voucher numbers. The point here is it will list the grant year associated with each grant. You can either look at the column that says grant year. You can also look at the grant number, and you see, for example, 2013 is B13, 2010 is B10, 2014 is B14. Remember that for all your pre-15 draws, this will not matter. You have no control over this. The system is pulling the oldest dollars first. But for 15, so in this case, you can see that it was funded for $51,000 out of 2014 based on what we said, but you can see that that money was coming from a variety of years. And this is exactly what grant-based accounting is getting rid of. However, this will stay in play until all those $14, all those $13, all those older pre-15 are spent. Now, once you start spending just on 15, then this information should tie to the information on the funding screen. But again, for those pre-15s, it will not. So if you use this report, make sure you understand that difference between, since we're in this transition period, some of the information will be correct, will follow what you put on your funding screen, and those pre-15 grants still will not follow. So in terms of our next steps, again, we have lots of time for additional questions, but for programmatic questions or concerns with timeliness, we're recommending that you contact your grant manager if you have additional concerns or questions. For technical assistance with IDIS, if something doesn't jive or you're having problems, you want to contact Crystal Stauffer. And then if you have any questions similar to the ones we addressed already, it can be scenarios like that sidewalk question, or when you pay for housing rehab over multiple units or multiple years. Questions like that are fine. What we would like to do is assemble a list of questions that are going through your heads right now in terms of grants-based accounting, and we would like to try to address those up front and avoid as many problems and cleanups as we can in the future. So again, if you didn't get a chance to ask, or you don't want to ask in front of everybody else on the webinar, I know Tina sent out an email. Tina, did you, are those going straight to you, or did you provide information in the request on where those questions should go?
Yes, if you have a question that you would like addressed in the frequently asked questions book, you can send them directly to my email address, and that is krpowell@pa.gov, and we will make sure that it is included. Chances are, if you have the question, some of your coworkers have the exact same question, so please submit the question, make it easier for yourself and your coworkers and your colleagues. Thanks.
Okay, and with that, that's the end of the PowerPoint at least, but like I said, I think we still have a few minutes here remaining for the webinar for additional questions, if there are any.
There is nothing that's waiting, but I'm just going to say that many of these accomplishment, I think, questions that you provided are helpful, and it's something that should be included in the FAQ, so we really appreciate you asking all of those.
Definitely. Okay, well, if there are no more questions, perhaps we can finish a little bit early. Were we supposed to go to 4 o'clock?
It's really up to Tina.
If there are no more questions, again, you can submit them offline to me at the email address, and I would like to thank you for attending.
Thank you, everybody.